We are live right now. Hello and welcome to Circle of Reason, the live edition. I'm not going to keep the camera on me. I'm going to introduce all of our lovely participants. We have Bailey, and we have Steven, and we have Jake.
We'll do it live.
I did.
I know. I was making a joke off that O'Reilly did. We'll do it live.
Oh.
It's a dumb joke, mostly.
Don't watch O'Reilly. I'm sorry.
Me neither.
Oh.
I don't either.
Okay.
I don't
Well,
know what that is. He doesn't even know what it is.
you're talking about Bill O'Reilly?
The O'Reilly factor. I don't know if that's still on.
I don't think it's a thing anymore.
Probably for the best.
Probably. So, our question today is diversity an ethnocentric ideal? Well, that's a pretty
Ethnocentric.
Hot topic, right?
well. It's also just a pretty loaded question, I guess. Like there's lots of ideas and stuff like that. And we have a new thing for Circle of Reason is I have these cool posters full of logical fallacies and cognitive biases.
Hefty.
So if at any point in time you feel like you need to correct somebody because they're being fallacious, is that a word? Because I think it should be. Feel free. And,
I like these. These are cute.
they're pretty cool.
Yeah.
So, but I thought if every day we could just start with that question, or we can go a little farther into what by the terms and stuff,
Yeah.
because that might be a better place to start.
So can we define ethnocentrism?
Yeah, we can.
How would you
I can't, but no.
You can't? Okay.
I'll gargle it.
You can go. Basically, I say like
Gargle
ethnocent.
it?
Well,
Thinking exclusively from one's own ethnicity, or putting more emphasis on the importance of one's own ethnic background or heritage.
Sure.
Thinking that your ancestry, your ethnic group is somehow superior or better, having higher quality traditions.
yeah, I think it's making sort of a value judgment about another person's
Mhm.
something, culture,
Yeah.
or something
Background.
from the perspective of your own.
And also thinking exclusively about things in terms of your culture, right?
Right.
Yeah. That would be an ethnocentric bias.
Sure.
Mhm. So the question was, is ethnocentrism, or is diversity an ethnocentric ideal?
Right. And so in diversity, I guess I'm referring to the political jargon, the connotation of it, not the literal meaning of it. But
Mhm.
when we say we have a certain thing that we mean by it, by being inclusive
Yeah.
and not
So is the
discriminating against or anything like
Yeah, so
that.
it sounds like the question mostly therefore is the current political movement around is that somehow an artifact of an ethnicity or a culture?
Hypocrisy.
Do you want me to print out the talent grant?
So I mean, would you consider it part of culture?
Is the idea that all cultures are
Equal, just making
Equal.
it worse or better.
part
So
of your
what do we
culture?
mean- Why don't
I guess
why
that's
don't we flush out what we mean by this diversity movement?
right. So does it mean that all cultures are equal? All cultures are
Well, I
you
think
have to respect all cultures or include all cultures, or is it all of those things, or is it that no one culture is better than anyone else's? That's basically the same thing as saying equal.
I think that those are a lot of the statements that are kind of implied or packed in to the diversity framing. I think that diversity, right, it's often phrased as diversity is our strength. And that comes from a few choice sociological studies that groups with a more diverse background, right, so like more people from more varied backgrounds or ethnicities or specializations, groups with more of that kind of diversity outperformed groups that were more homogeneous with
Really?
similar qualities.
So
Yeah, yeah.
interesting.
Yeah, that was where the sociological studies pointed this modern trend, and they kind of lean on that when it comes down to scientific claims That's a very specific claim, and they have definitely inflated that definition to various extremes. But yeah,
I think a big part of it is like trying to accept other people's differences, right? But obviously, it can get pretty engulfed, you know, like.
Well, also the question too of is cultural diversity and saying that cultural diversity is good, is that something that is specific to the American sort of culture?
right.
Well, that's where we're getting at,
Yeah,
because
Because there's some other cultures are more homogenous,
right.
and are not as
Diverse.
inclusive and diverse and
Are
stuff.
we better off for it?
In racial, other cultures are not as, racially
well,
inclusive and stuff. And then, but that's also kind of might be part of their culture to be more homogenous. And then if we say that we don't like that, then you're saying that you don't like another culture, and that it goes against your diversity. So that's a contradiction. So
well, yeah. So I think several things there. I think the most recent thing you said though is that like the idea of just blanket cultural relativism, which is what it
Right.
Falls apart under its own rules, which is without when you don't flesh it out properly or you don't really understand the nuances. And so if you work with a bad definition of it, like, all cultures can be equal and everyone can be included and all this kind of stuff, it's too broad and too vague and it doesn't actually deal with reality. And so
It ignores the situation.
well, there's some
it is
in some cultures where they
creates a
some
paradox
country
basically.
over there, or some culture over there may hate some other culture over there, and it's part of their culture to kind of fight against certain other kinds of people, and or I mean, it could be possible that could be included in a culture.
Right.
And
A culture has relatively hateful things, right? Encapsulated inside of it. But again, right, if we're going to be good cultural relativists, then hateful is from our defining, right?
that's what I'm saying.
Even if they
So-
define it themselves as hate, but it's a justified hate. They define it some other way. I think definitely cultural relativism is part of what has become the diversity movement in the political realm and the academic settings. Cultural relativism as an idea itself, is that everyone's equal. All cultures are equally valuable. I think
Valid is the right word I've been looking for.
Valid?
Valid.
Oh,
Yeah.
valid.
Yeah.
So
Me.
Yeah, well, yeah, the thing is that it may be like, to an extent, people are all living together, but cultural diverse, but
Mhm.
if you start going into, like, literally taking everything that a culture says as valid, then sometimes there can be really big conflicts there.
yeah, and there's the difference between validity and value, right? We can
Mhm.
value something even though it's not valid. I can value a mathematical equation for its elegance and its beauty, and it can say absolutely nothing about reality. But how it bends to the will of mathematics, whatever you want to say makes a mathematical equation beautiful. It's just not necessarily valid in its claim. And I think that the validity of cultural relativism hinges in the ethical realm and morality. But its position that of any kind of moral ethical framework is just as valuable, or in some instances, depending on how you want to argue for it, valid. And I think there's definitely a point at which that collapses on itself, because I think that when you start trying to make positivistic changes towards the idea of cultural relativism somehow respecting all at the same time, while completely ignoring real facets or outcomes that are generated by actions of those ethos, then there's necessarily a conflict. And I just think that there's a certain amount of entropy that's generated there.
Well, I think this is kind of an idea that I wanted to throw out to everybody. I don't know if it's the ending point, but it could be a good starting point. But the idea that all cultures are valid then leads to the idea that then no culture can criticize another culture.
Right.
Because the culture, then you are making a value judgment from your own culture, and so then you're being ethnocentric. So
Right.
then you can't do that. So then you remove, at that point, any type of ideal or better goal. There's no more achievement
Yeah.
because everybody has to play by like
Yeah.
a level playing ground. Like, so by removing like this is ideal and this is not ideal, like we should do less of this and more of this, then you kind of like you stunt progress.
Yeah.
And the whole point of cultural relativism is to be progressive, right? And so it's
I mean,
it seems like it to me.
Seems like
I think
It's like with the idea move forward as a society, but how can we say this is better than this if we can't judge other values and other cultures? So I guess it's a slippery slope that I wanted to like raise that to everyone.
well,
Is that a slippery slope? I thought there was a thing that says what the slope fallacy is.
I'm just thinking that something necessarily precipitates into things that are yet more
It isn't
tenuous in
necessarily
that
related.
direction.
Well, I'm not making the claim that it's a
Right,
slippery
no,
slope
no,
because
I know.
I think that if you go down
Yeah.
the road, then you get into some difficult things to deal with. That like
Yeah.
I don't think most people who are like hardcore or serious proponents of like cultural relativism would say that like there's no more ideal to which we can strive, but that's part of what we're trying to get at is like how can you have an ideal if you can't make a value judgment
And this is
from
the-
within your own
And
culture?
I think this is the thing, is like cultural relativism isn't it really, it's not built for those questions, right? Those answers. Like you're only supposed to take the moral axiom of cultural relativism that all cultures are equal, right? That's pretty much all that it's trying to do. And I don't see my problem's always been like, say I'm a cultural relativist and I look at another culture and I'm like, you know, I like my culture more than that one. You know, and I mean, I understand that it's only because I grew up in my culture that I like this one better.
Right, like an
And that-
in-group
and that-
preference or
and that
whatever.
my opinion is basically void of moral judgment. And
You're biased,
and,
right?
and yeah, and I'm just biased for that. And what is done right in that realm, what we typically see is criticism for not therefore somehow prostrating yourself at the coming of this other culture, right, and just absorbing it at face value and just taking it as it comes, and somehow just trying to absorb that.
Well, I think
in
it's
a-
just
in a-
you're thought of as it's an ethical flaw in your nature to not be completely welcoming of every other culture. I guess it's like you are,
right.
even if it's not intentional, that's the byproduct of some of this is like you get sort of attacked or you're thought less of on a moral or ethical level because you're not, completely welcoming to other cultures.
My confusion has always been like, why can't I understand that all ethos or all cultures are equal, and then still just advocate for mine anyway?
Right.
Why can't I just keep doing that? I will continue to advocate for mine and try to outperform other cultures, right? Even though I know that they're all valuable, they're all equally valuable and whatnot. But what's wrong with me doing that? And like the claim I can only imagine would be that you're not necessarily following like somehow they imply all of these actions that you would take therefore by thinking that all cultures are equally valuable. But I don't see why that's necessarily implied. I can act however I want and hold contradictory values internally. It doesn't necessarily mean anything. Right?
Well-
I can think everything's valued and then just constantly try to tamp down those other things that just because I feel like it, right? Does that make me
Right.
a good person or a bad person?
So-
I think that's relative.
I think the question then leads is to where did the ethical judgment come from that believing all cultures are valid come from? Like, why does that make you a more progressive or a better person, basically? Like, so so I think there's like the idea that like a person who believes all cultures are valid
Right.
is sort of actually like more advanced ethically or
Mm.
has a better grasp on the ethics of that. But then I guess
Why?
why?
Yeah, why?
Where did it come? So who is to say that all cultures are valid? Can
Is
you
it-
actually prove that to be true? And then why would believing that be a step forward ethically? Like,
Yeah.
is it
Yeah.
what? Where is that? I guess
There's
that's an
a
honest
lot-
question.
there's a lot to unpack in that question. The linguistic tendency for relativism comes out of it was a French thought a number of years ago, before right around the modern era, and it was used for literary criticism a lot of the time, and how we analyze these things. And then with the movement in, I can't remember exactly the other parts that I kind of wanted to address here, but the other tendency that we usually see in people, right? There's this puritanical aspect to
Mhm.
people, and there is a strong tradition of that in the United States. And so if they can inculcate themselves with something that allows them to feel morally superior, and all humans do this, they will use that to feel that, right?
Right.
And so this is a linguistic territory that allows for us to express caring, right, for others and acceptance of others, which is a very cosmopolitan ideal. We've been having a heavy urbanization, a heavy globalization, and increased communication networks and those sorts of things push people to moral signaling, right, to one another at a outsized, light speed sort of pace. We can tell millions of people that, like, I'm a really good person by accepting, the most heinous things, by people, trying to force everyone around us to be very accepting of things that people are just uncomfortable with, right? Because somehow you are that, right? If you're able to somehow accept these practices, then you are somehow more moral. And there's a certain amount of martyr mentality, savior mentality, and a lot of this is it happens. We see this also in psychological literature, that these sorts of mentalities, these kinds of personalities develop right as the people are coming, in and right out of teenage years, right? There's this period of time where we're really looking to either martyr ourselves, sacrifice ourselves, or just want to devote ourselves to something, entirely. There's this tendency for young people to kind of do that, and so there's this confluence of things. We've been pounding it into the education system for a long time, these relativistic thinking sorts of styles, and care mentality. And not that we shouldn't care for people, but
I think the idea is pretty inherent when you say, like, when you validate or when you value other cultures, and the idea is when you can put them together, there's a lot more you can learn from everybody, right? And how you choose to learn and use all that information is a lot more positive when you're trying to progress your culture. So I don't know why we're asking, why is it bad when we try to include other people?
No,
Now,
that
I
wasn't the
understand
question.
that.
Nope. I
no.
wasn't assuming or
Well, I
stating.
mean, it just kind of seems like that is an idea, but I think using all of everybody's influences and their knowledge and bringing it together obviously is the idea, right?
Right. But doesn't that just make your culture then, the one that's inclusive, better?
And you see, you're
Doesn't that doesn't the diverse state then become an ethnocentric state? And that because we include everyone, we are now superior to those that do not include everyone? And so that those
Depends
that
on how far you want to take it, I suppose.
well, that's the goal of philosophy, is to take it to the logical extreme and
I don't know
like
if that's
question
quite
it.
I don't know if that's quite the goal.
That's my goal in philosophy, I guess.
Definitely something worth talking about. I
It's
think what you're
worth
speaking to
considering,
is
yeah.
the melting pot, right? And the
Well,
melting pot mentality of people and cultures. And I think that's what the original diversity studies were about, right? Which was bringing together things and synthesizing.
So what's changed about it? I mean, like,
It's the mosaic now, right? In Canada, they've made it a mosaic. Canada is not a melting pot; it's a mosaic of cultures. So that they're all these clean little cultures, and they're well-defined little boxes, and that's where they live, and they can interact with one another. But never
don't
shall
necessarily?
never shall the two colors mix, right? And that's a completely different world than a melting pot, right? Which we used to have, and we do in many great respects still have in the United States. where cultures eventually
Sure.
blend and merge, and they create this new thing. And something I think is worth noting about the United States in particular is that uh, the United States rallies around not necessarily like blood and soil like some places, or like long history, traditions and bloodlines. And the United States rallies around ideas mostly. It's freedom, liberty, and these contractarianism, these laws, right? That's what the idea of the United States is. The largest critique against the United States and Canada is that we've colonized these territories, and it's true, those things happened, but there's more or less ways to read that history and to come to different moral conclusions.
Well, even from state to state, there's ethnocentrism.
Of course.
My state's better than the other state.
Right.
It's pretty clear. It's just interesting how, we want this ideal, but how many people are willing to, try to push for it,
Mhm.
and how many people actually recognize that what they're doing is legitimate, or is it just for personal gain?
Or is it just for, I don't know what, what ultimately is going on here with the actual doing of this?
By being like diverse and inclusive and all that kind of stuff, or
Yeah, I mean, I think we gained some stuff, definitely, but is
So
it?
what are those things? What do we gain?
like,
Perspectives, for one.
Okay,
Perspective,
different perspectives. and things,
different
different
abilities.
things.
I think different cultures have different proclivities, interests, strengths, weaknesses, ability to think differently,
Mhm.
creative abilities and stuff like that. I mean, based on where you live, the thought may never occur to you to use straw, to like make a roof, and then you meet somebody that can use bricks, and then you have mixed straw and bricks together, and then you have, so when you include different perspectives, different backgrounds and everything like that, you have the ability or the possibility
Yeah.
to find something new that neither one of you would have occurred, figured out on your own. I think that's the goal of including as many people from different cultures as possible, is you're increasing the probability of something new and dynamic happening
Right.
from this melting pot or whatever.
I think that's more of a melting pot thing, but I think there's some people that try to act like they're trying to separate the little things, and then that's kind of just sort of like making a little museums of cultures or something.
Yeah, it's the segregation, the ghettoization of cultures and places like that. Ultimately, it's ideas, right?
Right.
We want more ideas so that we can have more better ideas. And that's the diversity of ideas, is the push back against this diversity movement, because the fastest and easiest way to make the examples of today, like a college campus, the fastest and easiest way to make a college campus look diverse is by having a bunch of white and brown people evenly dispersed, right, everywhere in every department,
Mm-hmm.
as best as possible, right? That's kind of what they're trying to do, and because they're administrators, and half the time they don't care, and they're just looking for more tuition money, and it's a lot of poor incentives in the current higher education system. But that's a false kind of diversity, right? It's not real diversity. Real diversity is the diversity of thought, and diversity of thought isn't what color your skin is.
Right.
Yeah.
Well, I think a lot of it came from a lot of people's unwillingness to work with or mingle with or accept as valid someone else's culture. And so I think there's been a huge to sway people with a sort of moral argument that by being in your in group and being prejudiced and discriminating, you are like committing this moral mistake or whatever. And that, so therefore the idea or the ideology is it's, their culture is no less valid than your own. So stop being so resistant to them interacting with you, or whatever. Like, go meet them and find them and like share ideas and stuff like that. And I think it's been misunderstood and misconstrued in different ways, as like it's a being pushed as an ideology or something like that to convert people. And I think it was more just a response to people being stubborn, which is kind of what in groups do, the in group out group thing. And when you have multiple in groups and out groups, states or regions or villages or tribes or whatever, our innate tendency is to hold all of our ideas that we hold and beliefs like closer and surround ourselves with the people that agree with us and sort of keep creating tension. And I think the goal of it has been to alleviate that tension and try to increase the possibility for us to move forward somehow. And I think what you're kind of getting at is that inadvertently we've sort of mistaken our goal of creating better ideas with just creating more ethnic diversity, because it's kind of what we think we want. It's not really what we're getting at. And so culturally, we're trying to move in this direction, but there's so much resistance, and then maybe we haven't quite carried it out in the way that we want it to look like, stuff like that.
I think there's a lot of misinformation, and there's forced, there's a degree of force that's being projected onto the problem,
Mm-hmm.
and there's a lot of creating of problems a lot of the time. My experience has not been one where I've been essentially dealt with by racists, because I was a minority when I was going to high school in Southern California, and elementary school and things like that. But I just saw that as that's the majority.
Mm-hmm.
In my experience, it was just well, I don't have a lot of friends. I'm the new guy. Whatever. I'm getting treated shitty by all the Mexicans. What can I do about it? But not to digress here. The the idea that they've missed the mark. It's not that they've missed the idea. I think that the problem with these ideas is they're very specific. The ideas of cultural relativism, the ideas of critique and perspective taking, these things they have very specific applications, very powerful tools for the disciplines that they exist in. But it's the bringing of them all together and then trying to export them to political and social life. It looks like something very different, because not everybody can understand those things at that level. I'm not advocating that people aren't intelligent enough to get there, and they certainly are. But how do you make that happen, right? The actual execution of these ideas is either totalitarian or impossible. So, I mean,
Well,
it would be nice, right, if we could have a more actually diverse, right, intellectually, in light of intellectual, I mean idea diversity, and cultural diversity, sure, absolutely, we access to all of the things that we want access to, and that includes cultures. I don't know. I think that there's a certain amount of forgetfulness in people, especially in the United States. We've forgotten what the West looks like. We don't remember what our culture is, right? So we fail to realize the cultures that are around us, right? We feel kind of gray, right? And culture is what other people have, right? And we're constantly being projected this experience of culture is what other people have. White people don't have culture, it's been said. And I just think, it's a vast amount of ignorance that forgets the beautiful culture of the West. And I think that, really studying that, understanding your culture first, right? And the long tradition of what that means, right? Everyone should have this education, and everyone deserves to have access to identity with their own culture. There shouldn't be anything stopping anybody from going to school in most places and having access to learning something about where they came from, if they didn't, whatever comes from means, right? Because some people
Right.
seem desperately attached to where their
From.
chunk of biomass came from. As far as I'm concerned, we're all African, and before that, we're all North American, because there's those damn placental mammals that survived the first KT extinction and killed all the dinosaurs. Our mammalian ancestors came from North America, so as far as I'm concerned, we're all American.
Science.
On some level. funny amount of bickering.
I just think it's interesting. The morals and ethics of it just sort of seem to come out of nowhere. Don't really know
Morals are always difficult, you know.
where did it just pop up that this was somehow a new moral ideal to strive for.
Yeah.
Who decided that?
Well, it's
Why
not
did we
really-
agree with them?
It's not really new, you know, because it's essentially cosmopolitanism. It's just better articulated, which is, you know, people from different places and different cultures coming together along. Usually it was around trade and you know, trading, you know, whatever goods that we had and services, whatever you could have at the port and whatnot. You know, Venice has been doing it forever. They had huge cosmopolitan cities. It was just being accepting of other people and all these things. And the cities have always been that way, and that's why the
I
cities are
feel like
always
the
left-leaning.
West, like Greece and Rome,
Mhm.
were the ones that were doing it better, the
What
best.
does better mean? What's that mean?
I mean, like it was more successful, like people living at peace from different cultures and integrating and stuff like that. And then that's carried over into, you know, America, where we have like this huge conglomerate, and we welcomed
Mhm.
all the races, every race, everyone from
Yeah,
every
but the
country.
Romans were also taking over countries too.
Well,
Certainly
that's
they were.
what everybody throughout history has been doing, or not. It's either kind of it's either you're not or you are.
Mm.
I mean,
No, the Chinese, right?
the Chinese were, yeah,
The Chinese did
And the
most things first.
Mongolians and those
Yeah. Yeah, they
the
had,
Eastern Asians were imperial colonialists
Mhm.
before there was. I
Yeah.
mean, I don't know.
colonialists, depending on how you use the phrase. I mean,
The Mongols
the
had
human
China.
animal is a highly colonializing animal, first of
The
all.
Mongols had, the Mongols had.
I mean, the idea of taking over a place and then establishing your colony there,
Mongols took
Yeah.
over China.
not
held
unlike
China
a
for hundreds of
bacteria or
years.
a
So
virus.
before
Yeah.
before the Mongols dominated China, the empire, right? They had the first empire was because they were trying to was it Yangtze, yeah, the Yangtze River and the seasonal flooding, right? Much
Mhm.
like the Nile, and the levees and irrigation complexes that developed around the seasonal flooding of the Nile. The Yangtze was the Nile on steroids in the middle of a jungle, right? And so the Chinese had to figure out how to do that with rice, a much harder crop to establish and maintain and grow, and feed and preserve. So they had to build vast networks of cooperation, right? You know, these massive capacities to cooperate with one another were what their situation demanded, or very early on.
Or else they're all gonna die, right?
And their reward was the rice grain, which is not impressive as far as grains go, and the nutritional density that it can provide. Wheat, barley, mill, rye, that all those sorts of things. They have much more nutritional density to them. And also, China didn't have a lot of large land animals, right, for which to domesticate and to do labor for them. So, I mean, to this day, a lot of rice paddies are still done by hand. You know, a lot of rice gets picked by hand still, just simply because there's no easy way to cultivate it. Currently, China the party is moving them to potatoes because they can actually mass produce potatoes. They have arable land for it, and they're pushing potatoes on their population really hard so they can get away from rice because rice is devastatingly difficult to harvest. It's just a really tough grain to
It's
use.
so interesting though that they've been
Yeah.
like so able to flourish with such a difficult means of like mass nutrition.
They're highly they're exceptionally driven and disciplined, right? That's what they do culturally, right? They figure out a system and they make it work, right? A lot of the time. To speak very quickly about the whole of Chinese culture.
They still built the Great Wall of China even without a lot of large animals.
Certainly they did. Yeah. The China has always had, you know, a very large population, and they still have like the largest population on the planet. Dominated by the Han Chinese, much to the chagrin of many of the other Chinese people. China's extremely racist. It's amazing.
I heard some Chinese people racist to other types of Chinese.
That's what I'm talking about. The Han Chinese is a specific ethno group from Beijing, and they effectively, like, Mandarin is not some like version of Chinese. It is Han Chinese. That's what Mandarin is, and then they forced everyone else to learn it.
What about Cantonese?
Cantonese is from Canton, Guangzhou, the city I lived in. That's in like Hong Kong, they speak Cantonese, which is just a southern dialect, and they cannot speak to one another if those are the only languages they know. Mandarin and Cantonese do not translate well. Yeah, they can understand very little.
Well, there's some places where there's sort of a desert-ish area where there are taller Chinese with darker-ish skin.
Yeah, out west.
Yeah.
Uh-huh.
I mean, the continent or the country of China is
The size of America.
the size of it. Like, I'm sure
Yeah,
they
I think
have
it's-
very
it's-
diverse,
The largest by land
Climates
in North America is like
In any case, no. What do we mean by better, right? So like, given
I don't know, like the idea of like good and bad is
Yeah.
so vague. I mean, I guess that you could probably take maybe a Sam Harris approach in that it's anything promoting human flourishing,
Sure.
in which people live, prosper, get better, live longer, are more content and happier.
Yeah.
Is good.
Yeah.
And then anything on the opposite end of that is bad.
Yeah.
So
The sun
intentionally
is killing
murdering
me.
people
Yeah.
is
You're dying?
yeah.
Oh, Steven, you're dying.
They can't
Oh,
see.
tragedy. I'll trade
probably
seats
have
with
to
you.
move over to the other couch.
I'll trade
because the
seats
sun
with
is.
I like the seat.
Or is there? There's no blinds. No, sorry,
I'm trying to.
there are no blinds.
Yes, here we are. Just stare into the sun.
That's bad for your eyes.
Is it?
Yeah.
Oh yeah, why?
Because it
I don't want to
causes.
start a.
Because it doesn't promote human flourishing.
What has
Isn't there this thing about like how
Bend-
lenses refract light and then it like burns your cornea or something?
And the retina.
So yeah, it does damage to your lens. If you don't recover, then blah blah blah. Blah. Anyway, yeah, no, the Jared Diamond with his book Gun Journeys and Steel, talks a lot about development over the years and how all of those things impacted all civilizations, and the European continent with all of its valleys and mountains and severely domesticatable animals. The Asians had the horse for certain, and the horse made its way over here, and the conflict between valleys, right? And we developed, these isolationist attitudes all throughout the continent of Europe that affect the culture because they have such strong identities in different regions that aren't very far apart. from
I'm
one
gonna
another.
like make a jump here, but are you like, is the suggestion that the geography and like reinforce
Accessibility.
the idea of dualism for European cultures?
To a certain extent, yes.
Yeah.
I mean, that make a lot of sense to me.
Yeah, like if mountain ranges are separating two people groups, they're gonna, not be able to interact with each other.
Like a huge, big, flat
If
plain.
it was
that
like
would
a long
be
time
more
ago,
even.
mountain ranges were separating people that
Yeah.
would develop differently from each other.
I think it'd be a worthy endeavor to study the geography on culture, or the impact geography has on culture. That would be
Yeah.
interesting because
Yeah.
maybe we just hate each
Yeah.
other because there's mountains
I mean,
on a literal level.
No, very, very literally. People who live in mountains, right? When you civilize those people, when you domesticate the living of people who live in mountains, people who live on plains, they use agriculture, right?
Mhm.
People who live in mountains are herders, right? They have sheep usually, things like that. So the idea of all of your crop being stolen by thieves is very unlikely, right? Someone's not going to randomly run out into your field and harvest all of your wheat, right? It's going to be really difficult to run off with all of that. But it's really easy to run away with a few sheep, right? So there's this idea of retributive justice, right? That gets developed in these cultures that were mainly herders, right? Or mountain folk with those kinds of livestock situations.
Sure.
And so you get these cultures of honor, right? And retributive violence, right? Like in the South, we see a lot of retributive violence, like blood feuds, right?
Mhm.
Hatfield and McCoy.
Yeah, exactly. And cultures that develop around these honor systems, right? Like Afghanistan is highly mountainous, right? So there's a severe honor culture in the Middle East that's been developed over time, and those sorts of things don't wash out very easily. Like Scotland had a very serious problem with honor culture, and the old barbarian tribes were very similar. And then we started agriculture. Much more agricultural projects were done, and that's much more community, much more communal based. Everybody has to work
Well, you
together.
said
for
somebody
something to
had
work.
a problem with honor culture.
What's that?
You said someone had this.
So the problem with honor culture
Well,
is
probably
that
just kinda
it's difficult
contributed
to
to
build
their-
large scale communities around severely honor based cultures, right? Like to a large degree, honor is the most important thing. Like in China, they have something similar to honor in that it's like losing face, right? So if you say, if I shame you somehow in public, right, you lose face, right? And then you can,
Reputation.
yeah, you will take it out on me, or you'll try to make me lose face, right? That sort of thing. Or you somehow try to save your face, or if I save your face for you, right? If I make you look, honorable, and or if you say something foolish, and then I help you save face, right? Then you owe me something, right? Then there's this whole social dynamic. It's gauged culturally in the idea of having and saving face. Yeah. And in the same way, the Middle East stoning your daughter for whatever, half the things they do. Yeah. So, and that's the thing. I mean, we can see this is all very well documented. The rates of violence, the rates of retributive violence, things like this. We can see this in other cultures, and we can think, does this, help us get along with one another? Does this support the idea that we're all trying to work together to better the species, right? Or,
If you're thinking of the
global
of
society.
the flourishing idea, if you're thinking of the
Right.
flourishing idea, then that can cause trouble.
Right. And so, I mean, the idea of wanting globalism, the idea of thinking from that place, right? The idea of wanting to know if, when we compare, or that there might be a hierarchy of values here, it would be pointed at that you're coming from a hierarchical, egalitarian, meritocratic society and culture, aka the West, and therefore you're biased, right?
Of course.
So having those perspectives doesn't in any way prove that that's objective fact, right? And that's the moral relativist position. And I was like, that's fine. Ultimately, I come down to, okay, maybe it's not that way. Maybe it's not objective. I'm gonna do it anyway. What do you say, right? And this is the thing. Is like as soon as I say I'm gonna do it anyway, right? The moral relativist can't say anything. You can't shame me if that's what I'm gonna do, even if I think I'm wrong, even if I know that I could be. I'm not acting morally, right? I'm not acting immorally, but I'm not acting morally. So I just don't have to accept that. In my understanding of moral relativism, if you can have that understanding and not necessarily follow those prescripts. There's the implication of morals, right? Everybody just assumes we should want that. And then we tell each other that, and then as far as you don't live up to that, they shame you for it.
Right.
Yeah.
Well, the question always comes to my mind is that what can you ever not look at the world through the lens of your culture?
No.
And so then how can you claim that there's the ability to look at the world outside of the lens of your culture? Because you'll always have that. You will always have
Yep.
mental, cognitive, cultural biases.
Right.
And it kind of is interesting to claim that you can look at things from another person's perspective. And it's like, yes, kind of, but you're
To
still
an extent, right?
only to an extent. You will never,
This
I
is
mean,
why-
there's an author that wrote about like the experience of being a bat. And that you can imagine yourself as a bat, but you will never truly, objectively, empirically know what it feels like to be inside the mind of a bat because
Oh, yeah.
you are not a bat. And so like you can say that it's a really good idea to validate all cultures and like all cultures are valid and equal and everything like that. But like, and you can try and look at things from another perspective, but you'll still always be limited by the culture that you grew up in. And like you can try really hard, but you'll still never really achieve the essence of seeing things from another person's perspective. I guess like you can try to, but I guess you're never really going to get, I think, to where you want to go. I think that's an interesting thing for me to think about is like
Right.
you should try and
Is that the same
incorporate
thing?
all
Isn't that the
perspectives,
same thing
but
about
then
trying
like
to think of things from, if I were trying to think of things from your point of view, just on an individual basis, when it's even basically the same culture, think of things from Daniel's perspective, I still won't know for sure if something is think about something the way Daniel thinks, because I didn't have all of his memories in my head.
right.
You can only Daniel's thinking insofar as it's what you think of Daniel's thinking,
Mm-hmm.
right?
It's like we're always distilling
Yeah.
ideas from other things, but then it's in our brain,
Yeah.
and it's still our brain trying to make assumptions or conclusions about someone else's brain,
Right.
you know, and it's
And so
The that is through communication, I think.
How,
but-
is there a way where you can experience other people's cultures more thoroughly? Besides, I mean, obviously visiting them and being in their presence.
Well, you can do cultural appropriation.
Yeah, and there's certain, there's a lot of.
That's a whole nother subset, though.
I know, but I'm saying is,
Self-contradiction. of
Like
the
you
day.
can,
Yeah.
yeah, I mean, it's like you have to validate all cultures, but if you do anything from another culture, you're appropriating
You
it,
better
which
not
is
enjoy them, you know.
ethically, it's ethically immoral to appropriate another culture, even if you're enjoying it. I guess I can understand it if you're doing it out of like mockery, or you're trying to devalue. But if it's not your intent, then how is it? Yeah, see, like I think you run into some different fallacies there too.
Well, then it's all point of view too. So I mean,
It's all point of view. Well, isn't that relativism though?
well, that's
all-
what it is.
Point of view. Even your point of view on the relativism
I
is
gotta get going,
point
guys.
of view.
Get to your activity center.
Oh, yeah. Have fun.
Thanks for joining us, Jake.
Hey, man.
Thanks.
10 more this week.
Yeah.
Mike said he got distracted and went to the coast,
Nice. Good for him.
which is a good day to go to the coast.
Yeah,
It is a good
Bright
day.
and sunny.
Yeah.
it'll be fun.
We should do a coast trip for CA.
Yeah.
And the sun's really getting to me now, and I have to stand up. I can't sit down at that angle anymore.
It's totally fine. No, I don't know. I feel like though, if like most people that sort of ascribe to moral relativism just realize that it's just a different type of ethnocentrism that's more inclusive, but it's still basically ethnocentrism. Like, I would be more okay with that. But I guess I feel like if you talk to somebody, they'd be like, well, no, I'm not being ethnocentric because I value everybody's perspective and stuff like that. It's like, we're just moving the goalpost, essentially, or the goal.
Sure. We're never steady end goal, right? I always wish it was different. I think that's just basic psychology. I have to get to a class in Corvallis.
All right. Well, it's been about an hour anyway, so.
Yeah. It's good to move. See you guys tomorrow.
See ya. Well, anyone that's watched, thank you for joining us. We will be back next week. Goodbye.